Hello, and welcome to The Leadership Edge. I am your host, Ted Gorski. The Leadership Edge is a show that focuses on leadership topics that may be impacting you on a daily basis. And on this show, we talk about those particular topics, and what we do is we provide you tips and techniques that can help you survive the daily grind. In today's themed show is something that's kind of really I've been thinking about for a while. It's called the 5 Deadly Sins of Leadership. And this was motivated by some of the recent coaching sessions I've had that I've seen some common themes throughout. And I said to myself, this is something I want to share on a show. Because I'm sensing there's a lot of leaders out there that might be really dealing with the same kind of issues in these 5 areas. And I want you to assess yourself as we kind of go through them today and say to yourself, where do I stand on these? Are these issues that I have to kind of wrestle with and deal with and resolve? Because if you have some of these deadly sins, it's impacting your leadership. So, here is kind of the agenda that we're going to be looking at here today. First is ineffective communication. We're going to be talking about the style's impact and how that might be affecting your messaging. Second point is ineffective feedback. And what is effective versus ineffective feedback? The third deadly sin is empathy or lack thereof. And we're going to talk about why that's so important. 4 is energy cycles. Are you dealing with these whole things called low energy cycles, and what happens if you are, and how is it impacting your leadership? And lastly, this whole thing of negative triggers. These are self-sabotaging behaviors that could be impacting your ability to be an effective leader. These are the 5 deadly sins, and we're going to be talking about these deadly sins, why they're so deadly, and more importantly, what you can do if you do have some of these deadly sins to resolve them. So let's start with the first deadly sin, ineffective communication. I'm going to say this deadly sin is probably one of the most common one I've encountered in my coaching career. It's ineffective communication both with team members. Could be ineffective communication dealing with peers, but it's impacting their ability to get effective results. It's really understanding kind of how communication goes awry. One of my favorite quotes is from the late Stephen Covey, who said, "We see the world not as it is, but as we are." What Stephen was getting at is that we as leaders, as individuals, see the world from different lenses. We see the world through our lens. These lenses are created from history, from behaviors, and from just your daily life experiences. And you kind of see the world through that lens. But what happens when someone has a different lens perspective? And most of the time that when I deal with leaders and organizations, what happens is they get fixated on how their lens is. They get fixated and kind of see it only through their prism. And they're not taking the time to step back and saying, okay, how is this other person seeing it? How is this person interpreting their world? Do I need to kind of change my message so it lands a little bit differently? And that's the whole key thing here, is understanding self-awareness of what your particular style is. Because in any kind of situation, the question you have to ask yourself is, how do you know when your communication's ineffective? You're walking down the hall talking to, let's say, a peer. And as you're talking with the peer and you're looking at them, what gives you clues that maybe the communication is ineffective? I'll say this, and some of the things you may experience is that someone might be distracted. Someone may not be looking at you. Someone may be asking you questions in a different tone. Maybe their tone's a little bit slower. Maybe they're getting a little fidgety. Whatever that body language is, when it's a little different, when there's a different perspective on things, what you might see is their body language change. And it doesn't matter how clear your message is, if you're seeing it from two different lenses, most likely the communication is not going to get through. Here is a perfect example of a communication process model so you can get an understanding on how this might be all working. As the speaker, you are approaching somebody and creating a message. That message might be what you need them to do, gets communicated downward to the person you're communicating with, who's the listener. You as the speaker are encoding a message. And when you encode a message, what you're doing is packaging the message the way you like it packaged. Think of it as a gift, that you're wrapping a gift and you're dropping the message in that box and wrapping that box up and sliding it across the table to the person you're speaking to. That's encoding it, and you're wrapping it the way you like it. You wrap it the way you're most comfortable with. But the person on the other end who's decoding it, think of it as unwrapping it. So they're taking and ripping the wrapping apart. They rip it apart according to their style. Now, if your style and their style by chance are similar, what ends up happening is the message is seamless. The message gets through. The next day, you may be making a request. The person brings it to you and says, here's the report. You look at it and say, fantastic, that's exactly what I wanted. But what happens when you're different? Well, most likely the next day when you say, can I see the report, you look at it, you might go, what the hell is this? Has that happened to you? That is probably a sign that you're dealing with two different communication styles. And as a result, your communications did not connect. To get back to the slide, there are three ways that you encode a message. The three ways in the top right of the screen that you encode a message is what's called body language, and number one. It's how you're sitting, it's how you're standing. Do you use facial expressions? Do you use your hands? So body language is one way that you communicate a message. The second way is through your tone of voice. Is it loud? Is it soft? Is it fast? Is it slow? And lastly, it's the physical words you use. Each of those three elements is the way that you encode a message. Well, if you look in the bottom right of that slide and where you're decoding the message, the person decodes the message in the three same ways, through body language, through tone, and through words. So you can see what kind of happens here when there's a miscommunication, because each of the communication styles, and there's 4 of them, process body language different, have different tones of voice, and use different words. So you can see what happens here when there's miscommunication, because they're misinterpreting each one of those elements. So it's important to understand this when your communication is ineffective, because here's the realities. You cannot not communicate. When you're approaching somebody, you're communicating without you even saying a word. When you're entering a room, you're communicating without even saying a word. I recently was approached by a leader who asked me to coach her. And I asked her why, or what were her challenges. And one of the things she said to me was, Ted, my Monday morning status meetings are absolutely terrible. I come into the meeting, my team does not really say a word. And it's just it's very frustrating to me. Well, I said, great, we can work on that. So the following week, we had our scheduled session, and I was sitting in a conference room, and she come walking in. And as soon as she walked in, I said, oh my goodness. You see, I kind of knew the styles that were on her team, because I've done a lot of work in this organization. And the way she walked in, I totally understood the dynamics that the people in that meeting were shutting down, because she was communicating just by walking in a room. So I literally had her practice 45 minutes walking in a room. And I thought she was going to fire me after the first 10 minutes. But what's interesting is when I saw her the following week and asked her how the meeting went, she said, oh, it was probably one of the best meetings. Now, it wasn't at the place we wanted it to be, but it was moving in the right direction. So again, you communicate with your body language no matter what happens without even saying a word. Because the meetings are in the people, not the words. It's what the people are saying. And here's the reality. All communication is received, but 70 to 90% are filtered. So you can see what happens when you have different communication styles. This is where miscommunication can occur. Because here's the reality. We're looking at hearing versus listening. Hearing is transmitting and accepting the sound waves. Listening is putting meaning to them. So you can see what happens since the meaning is in the people are putting the meaning in that transmission of what you're saying. And if you happen to have different styles into play, it can cause that message not to get through. Because the reality is this, we can speak at 150 words a minute. And you're saying, well, Ted, you haven't seen my family over the holidays. They can speak a whole lot faster. I get it. But for the most part, it's 150. We can listen at 500. But that leaves 350 words per minute to tune out. So you can see what happens is that people can kind of tune out from the actual message. So the key thing here to understand as a leader is understanding these communication traits and knowing that you have to make sure that you're talking to the right style and making sure that you're communicating to the right style in the way they like to receive their message. So that's deadly sin number one. Deadly sin number two is ineffective feedback. Let me state this. I will tell you that feedback is the most underappreciated skill set that leaders utilize. And I will speak on that most leaders don't even use it. And their concept of feedback is once a year in a performance evaluation. I will tell you that lots of styles out there do not appreciate just being given feedback once a year. Your job as a leader is to give consistent feedback. But I'm going to tell you that for organizations and the people and the leaders I've worked with, this is a skill and something that's not being done. And it's a travesty. Because just like everybody needs feedback, whether it's your kids, whether it's the people that work for you. And it's the one thing that we as leaders are doing terrible in. So you might be asking yourself, okay, well, what's ineffective feedback? Couple of things here. I'm not going to talk about each one on the screen here, but the key thing that I want to speak on are the two that are in red. Focuses on liabilities and is time pressured. Ineffective feedback means you're focusing on what's not being done. You're focusing on someone's inefficiencies and focusing on that and really focusing it on a negative perspective. Also, it's time pressured. You're saying to yourself, I got 5 minutes. I'm going to provide 5 minutes of quick feedback. Ineffective feedback causes people not to really replicate behavior you want to replicate in a good way. So the key thing here I want you to realize when ineffective feedback is it's not providing the food and the fuel to get the kind of results you're looking for. Whereas effective feedback focuses on the strengths of the individual. Effective feedback uses constructive language or positive language. Effective feedback allows sufficient time. And more importantly, effective feedback is specific. It tells you specifically what someone's doing and what's doing right. They're not guessing what it is. And I will tell you, the most effective leaders I work with understand the power of effective feedback. It's timely, it's specific, and they give it to their employees as quickly as they can because it fuels them. So here's my challenge to you in regards to the remedy in terms of effective and ineffective feedback. I call it Catch the Good Patrol exercise. And I coach this with the leaders that I coach. And this is what I say to them. On a daily basis, for the most of the time, leaders have to go off, get coffee, or go to the ladies' or men's room. I ask them for 5 minutes to walk down a hall and look for good. Look for something that someone's doing good in. Maybe it's how they handle the problem. Maybe how they're interacting with an employee. And what I want you to do is give feedback, good feedback, and only look for good things. If you see something not happening that should be happening, you're not going to focus in on that. You're going to focus just on the good stuff that people are doing. And I want you just to kind of give the feedback and say, I saw what you did there, great job. And here's the thing, if you catch it in the first minute, you get 4 more minutes to find another one. So I challenge you to try this. And I promise you that if you do this consistently on a daily basis, all of a sudden 5 minutes will turn to 10. In that 10-minute investment, you're going to get a lot out of it because you're going to provide strong, solid feedback to those people. They're going to appreciate it and work much harder for you. So that's one of my challenges for you in regards to remedying the problem of ineffective feedback. Our third deadly sin is lack of empathy. Now, to understand what empathy is to understanding what someone is feeling at a given time. It's not necessarily to agree with it. It's really funny how when I'm coaching leaders and I talk about lack of empathy, it may show up in maybe an emotional intelligence assessment that they're lacking empathy and they have some challenges there. And we talk about how to kind of garner this thing called empathy. And one of the things they tell me is, Ted, listen, I don't want to come across as, I don't want to be show empathy because I might show weakness. Or if I show empathy, it shows that I kind of agree with somebody. It's farther from the truth. What empathy says is that you connect with someone from a human perspective, and what it does is shows you that you're human. It shows you that you understand. If someone is supposed to get a report to you on Friday at noon, but someone, let's say their child was sick and they're in the hospital all night, and they couldn't get it to you by noon, you can at least to show empathy say, I can understand what happened here and why. But the key thing is to really say to them, okay, knowing the situation, when can you get me the report? Once they get you the report, then you can kind of have a conversation to say, okay, what can you do next time so something like this may not happen? Where if your child does get sick, that you can still hit the deadline. It's understanding where they're at because we've all been there. But to come across as cold and heartless doesn't have you come across as human. So showing empathy is not a weakness. Showing empathy is really showing that you care and that you're human. But you may say to yourself, okay, well, how can I do that? What kind of tool can I use? Well, there's one tool you can use which is called empathy statements. And what empathy statements are is something that shows you that you're conveying an understanding, that you understand the emotion of what's happening, that part of it is that you can deliver it with sincerity. But an empathy statement is something that helps you understand, more importantly, understand the feeling that's behind it. And the kind of the statement format is as follows. The first statement is, it seems, or I can understand, or I realize, I see. So when someone is going through something, they're struggling with something, you can say, I can see that you are. The second part is the feeling. Identify the feeling that that person may be experiencing. And lastly, tie it back to the situation. So for example, let's say a customer is walking in to a car dealership to get their car repaired and it was supposed to be repaired. They come in and they just find out that it's not repaired at the time it's supposed to be, but it's going to take a whole lot longer. Well, your empathy statement can be, I can understand, Mr. Gorski, that you're upset that your car is not done on time. You know, let's see what we can do to kind of alleviate the situation for you. So it just helps you understand that you're connecting to the situation and that you can understand the emotion that's part of that situation. So your remedy for this is to practice empathy statements, is to practice those things so the display that you understand kind of the emotion at play. Our fourth deadly sin is low energy cycles. And I'm going to say that this is probably another deadly sin that all leaders deal with. It's a deadly sin that I'm always working with the leaders I'm with on developing their ability to develop more energy in their day-to-day activities. So think of energy cycles, or think of your energy as a gas tank. And when your gas tank is low, let's use the gas gauge for a moment in your car. When your gas gauge is low in your car, when it goes past E, most likely your car is going to stop. It will reach a point and just kind of go past the E, it's going to stop. Unlike the Seinfeld episode where they went past the E and they went so many times, so far away, your car is eventually going to stop. But the difference between us and a car is as humans, we have energy cycles. And when we go past E, unfortunately, we don't stop. We continue. And as a result, when you continue, you start to not be as effective as you are. So what ends up happening is maybe you're not as effective, you're not as patient, you're not as a good listener. You give up a whole lot easier. What happens is you're depleted. And that causes you not to be the most efficient leader that you can be. So how do we resolve that? Well, it's an exercise that's called What Energizes You. And simply, you think of, if I gave you a day off to do whatever you want to do, what would you do? And it's simply being selfish. You can kind of put down into task what you like to do. I have people who say, I'll play a round of golf. I have some leaders who say they'll go for a run. I have other leaders that say, I will go to the beach and read a book. Whatever it is, it's creating that list. And the thing about this list is it doesn't have to be heavy in terms of activities. Meaning you don't have to say, I want to take a trip to Aruba or go on a cruise. It can be simple things like going to the park and reading a book. But the real trick here is putting it in your schedule on a weekly basis. So I challenge you, if your energy is depleted and you're low and you're finding that you're not as effective, it's most likely you're depleted in your energy. Make the list and put these activities in your calendar on a weekly basis. You have to put what activity a week in your calendar. And I also would put an activity that you can do during lunch. Maybe go for a walk or maybe take a lunch and go to the park. But do something, create that list, and put it in your weekly calendar. The last deadly sin is what we call negative triggers. And negative triggers are triggers that get you into an emotional state. So for example, if you have disruptive emotions and they control you, for example, if you say things, I take things personally, I'm critical of myself, I'm sensitive to disapproval. Whatever, these are disruptive emotions that are controlling you. I was just coaching a leader today who was telling me that one of the issues they have is people who think slowly. They don't think as fast as her, or they talk slowly, is a trigger for her because she gets disruptive emotions around that. She makes those people feel uncomfortable. Here's the reality. A trigger can be it could be body language. It could be how someone's walking towards you. It could be how someone's sitting. It could be a look. It can be a phrase. It can be a word. It can be a tone of voice. The key thing here is to kind of identify those, because the more you can identify, the more effective you're going to be, because you'll help kind of reduce that emotional trigger. You'll reduce the sensitivity of that trigger in you. So the remedy here is to do what's called a What Triggers You exercise. Think of a situation where you got emotional recently and try to identify the triggers. Try to identify them, because the more you can expose them, the less power they'll have over you. And I would tell you the most ineffective leaders I've seen are the ones that don't understand their triggers, and it overwhelms them. Do not allow this to happen to you. The more you can identify, the less power it has over you, and as a result, you won't get into those emotional trigger disruptive situations. So, in summary, these were the 5 deadly sins: ineffective communication, ineffective feedback, lack of empathy, number 4 is low energy cycles, and number 5 is personal negative triggers. If one of these is impacting you as a leader, what I suggest you to do is do some of the exercises that we talked about on the show today to really work on those, because if you have any of these, it is impacting your leadership negatively, and most likely impact your ability to move up the leadership channel. So I encourage you to kind of really do a self-assessment on yourself to see where you stand in these particular areas, and kind of help resolve these by some of the activities that we mentioned here today. So in closing, if there's anything we can do to help you with your leadership needs, please reach out to us at www.getYourEdge.com, and we'll be more than happy to help you and see what we can do to help you improve your efficiencies and the results that you're getting in your leadership. Other than that, my name is Ted Gorski. Thank you for tuning in to this week's show, and see you next week on the Leadership Edge.